Hello and welcome to the National Security Conversation. Does India as a modern state think strategically? Should India have a national security strategy? Does India have a national security strategy? What are the pluses and minuses of the various declassified Indian military doctrines? India has had a very reluctant doctrinal tradition. Since 1995, this reluctance has started changing when the Indian Air Force declassified the first official air doctrine. Since then, the two other arms of the Indian military, the Indian Navy and the Indian Army, have also declassified some of their doctrines. The Indian Army issued declassified doctrines in 1998 and 2004. The Indian Navy declassified its first ever maritime doctrine in 2004. The Indian Air Force issued new doctrines in 2007 and 2012. The Indian Navy issued new versions of the 2004 doctrine in 2009 and 2015 and issued two additional naval strategy documents. The Indian Army has not issued any revised declassified doctrine since 2004. In 2017, just last year, the Headquarters Integrated Defence Staff released a joint doctrine of the Indian Armed Forces, which had been kept classified since 2006. So we have several doctrines in existence today. It is perhaps therefore opportune to take a look at the pluses and minuses of the military doctrines we have and what can be done in order to better these doctrines. To discuss this and more, I have with me in the studio Colonel Ali Ahmed. Ali Ahmed retired from the Indian Army in 2008. He served with the Maratha Light Infantry. He has a PhD from the Jawaharlal Nehru University in international politics. He also taught briefly at the Jamia Millia Islamia University. Dr. Ahmed, welcome to the National Security Conversation.
Thank you.
Should I call you Dr. Ahmed or Colonel Ahmed?
Ali is fine.
Perfect. Ali, let me begin by asking you how you understand a military doctrine. Should a military doctrine be a written down document? And how should a doctrine sort of balance transparency with secrecy? So just for the benefit of our viewers, if you could sort of explain the various aspects of a doctrine in sort of conceptual terms.
A military doctrine is expected to put the military on the same page. A military as big as India's, more than 1 million strong,
Right.
And it's got three different arms. You've got the Army, the Navy, the Air Force. So all of them, if they are to read out of the same book, they need to be such a book, and that's what's military doctrine. And each of them, since they are a service in themselves, they also have respective service doctrines. And then they do so many things. For instance, they would be involved in subconventional operations. They would do specialized operations. They have special forces. So those also need to be having some kind of a framework so that there is a joint understanding, a shared understanding. Within each service and then across all the services. And that's the work of a doctrine.
What is the utility of that?
So whether it's the utility is obviously to put everybody on the same page so that when they do their planning, when they do other downstream things like training, equipment acquisitions, etc., they would have the doctrine that will then help them do that as a guiding principles, frameworks, arrive at a general understanding. Why should it be written? So as to make it accessible, to help with its dissemination, to help with the training, etc. And in terms of transparency, indeed, that should be the case. Why? We are a democracy. We want our democratic institutions to be informed by what's happening in the military field. And doctrine is one way we can access the thinking in the military. In any case, it's not meant to be an entirely military-centric exercise, doctrine making. It has to have a civil-military, a joint engagement in the creation, the writing of a doctrine.
But Ali, some people would argue that the white papers, doctrines, or even the Comptroller and Auditor General reports on defense issues or Parliamentary Standing Committee reports. These are very detailed reports. They should not be made public because some of the weaknesses and strengths of your armed forces that are discussed or shortcomings of the armed forces that are discussed in these documents will sort of make the adversary more aware of what you are as a nation and what your strengths and weaknesses are. How do you respond to that kind of an argument?
The primary feature of India is that we are a democracy.
Right.
Democracy entails transparency, and transparency involves institutions like the parliament, the CAG, etc., looking at field like the military. Since the military takes in a lot of our resources, how they are being spent, are they being spent wisely, etc., is something that needs to be kept a tag of and supervised to the extent. And and in terms of the parliamentary and executive division of labor, how the parliament engages with what the government does in the defense field is through this. Therefore, the transparency is something that is one of the good features that we have. In terms of the advantage is it reassures the rest of us, the citizens, to know what exactly, and it's going on well, etc. It also, incidentally, is also to messaging to our neighbors, to our potential adversaries, to our allies, to our friends, to our strategic partners, that this is where India is headed in the strategic field, and therefore they know where to engage with us, how to plug in to Indian defense enterprise. And therefore it's a good thing, altogether good thing that this happens, including the criticism that you mentioned.
Right. But isn't there a difference between a declared doctrine and an operational doctrine? And how different are they, or how similar are they?
I presume you're referring to certain criticism regarding our nuclear doctrine. We have a declaratory nuclear doctrine, which is the official document,
That's correct.
2003, and based on the draft of 1999. But since there has been no change in that doctrine since 2003, it brings up this suspicion that they must, while everything else has gone on in the strategic sphere, in the technological sphere, how is it that the doctrine has not changed? It may be possible that it doesn't need to change. Nevertheless, the suspicion then arises, is there an operational doctrine which is distinct and different from the declaratory doctrine?
Is there?
Personally, yes, I would suspect there is. I don't think that the stasis that attends the official declaratory doctrine surely, it doesn't stand to reason, it doesn't stand to logic. Therefore, there is something that's been going on doctrinally within, the national security system, which we are not aware of in full.
We survived as a country till 1995 without any declared military doctrines. So does the absence of military doctrines hurt? Is it imperative for a nation to have respective military doctrines, joint doctrine, and probably even a national security doctrine? Why is that important? Because we did survive for so many years without any of these.
That's right. So if the military were to ask them, they would say, look, we did pretty well, which means it didn't hurt. And which means the absence of a written document doesn't mean we did not have an understanding. So they had a military-wide understanding of what they needed to do and how to do it, but it was not, as you say, in a written form, and that's kind of developed 95 onwards. The doctrinal effervescence has happened over the turn of the century and continues till this day. Of the past, they would say that, yes, they had a doctrine. It wasn't self-consciously as a doctrine. They would call it a pamphlet. So they had some wonderfully written pamphlets by their predecessors, which served the purpose of doctrine.
Well, that's interesting. So you're saying that although the Indian Army declassified its first doctrine in 2004, the Indian Army was not bereft of any doctrinal thinking before 2004. It did have some aspects what could constitute some sort of a doctrine. Is that what you're hinting at?
I would say 2004, yes. Then there was one document that preceded it in 1998.
Right.
Fundamentals of Doctrine or some such name. So there was this idea within the military to put it down to paper, but they were already building on something that they already had, this shared understanding of how to fight the nation's wars, and they did pretty well at it. they kept India together, they defended India very well. So it's something that worked. But beyond the point, they felt a need to change. And obviously, there was so much of change. There was a revolution in military affairs. The way the United States, for instance, started fighting its wars, it was all very educative for the military. So they felt a need to move on. Plus, there were other reasons, the regional security situation, etc., that prompted them to do a little bit more thinking than what they had inherited.
Let me press that point a little more. So if I understand you correctly, you are saying there was some doctrinal thinking within the armed forces, but they were not put in black and white in cold print, and it was not given to various levels, various rungs of the armed forces, but there was a certain thinking that was going on. That's one part of it. The other part is that it was not declared till 2004, or in the case of the Indian Air Force until 1995. What explains this doctrinal reluctance in the Indian military?
They didn't have a written document. You're right about that. Now, why they didn't have is this, because they had something as a substitute for that. In those days, it used to be called pamphlet. So the general staff pamphlets. General staff pamphlets are kind of authenticated military, endorsed documents that
They're not declassified.
Yes, they were at best restricted. So they were not in the open domain, let's say, but they were within the military, and they were shared widely. And at every level, the level they needed to reach. So people read that, people understood that, they were disseminated through the courses of instruction. So the military was on the same page even before, without the explicit and written doctrine.
So would you say more pronounced, robust doctrinal thinking started in the 80s with General Sundarji and others? Would you sort of go back to that, or even prior to that?
Yes, I think the professionalization of the military takes place around 60s, between the 62 war and the 71 war, and 71 seems taken as the epitome of their work. And thereafter, they see themselves as professionals and pursuing a calling. And then they prepare themselves accordingly. So they take it much more seriously. They're no longer amateurs. They're no longer, in the British military tradition, etc. They are now much more focused, much more professionalized. They interface with other militaries. They import those ideas. For instance, if there's a discussion of air-land battle, etc. in the United States, it will find expression here too. So all that, and the 90s, as you know, really the revolution, military affairs, the way the Gulf War was fought, etc. That brings home to them that there's much more needs to be done. That's probably prompted them to get on with it.
You mentioned the British military tradition. So if you sort of look at from an ideational, philosophical point of view, the sources of India's military doctrine, would you say the British legacy did play a very crucial role in shaping up the Indian military traditions and doctrinal thinking thereafter? For instance, on the question of the defensive posturing, would you say that was a after effect of the British system, which basically was to sort of defend the colonial India from invaders, etc. So how far did the British military thinking play a role in the independent Indian doctrinal thinking?
Considerable. As you know, we kept on some of the chiefs of our services to after independence, and then when our officers grew in seniority and then in maturity and thinking, etc., we started thinking for ourselves. We also expanded the scope of our engagement with foreign militaries to include the Russian, the American. We did courses in those countries. So we brought back ideas. Plus, we've operated across Indian soil, whether it's mountains, jungles, all our borders. We fought wars. So all those impacted our thinking. So it's, yes, we might have begun with the British legacy, and that's institutional, inheritance. But we've taken it forward. We've Indianized it. We've brought it to the region. How to cope with Pakistan, how to cope with China, that's not something the British did. It's something that we have done, and tremendously well.
From your earlier answers, I got the feeling that you're arguing that the doctrines do have an impact, defining impact on the behavior of the military. Having looked at the Indian doctrines from 1995 up to 2017, do you think these doctrines have had an impact on the behavior, behavior, thinking, and ideational processes of the three arms of the Indian military? As an objective analyst, you've written a lot about it.
I should think so. They've gone about it rather systematically. They've written down the doctrine, then they've disseminated it widely. They've also written these open documents, which then get discussed in the strategic community. You have a very wide military veterans community, which then feeds back and mirrors what, and then passes it on to the civil society, what's the internal thinking within the military. So within the military, there is a lot of emphasis on the intellectual development of officers. They've got courses where dissemination of this doctrine takes place. So I would think that it's been considerable, this doctrinal dissemination, to put everybody on the same page, especially because now the officers are exposed to so much else. So the military has to work that much harder to make them, focus.
I get the feeling that you're being very conservative in your sort of answer to that. Why do I say that? I think I get the feeling, talking to a lot of people on military doctrines, that there is very little consultation that takes place among the services while the doctrines are formulated, and two, the consultation between the civilians and the military officers is very little on the doctrinal formation. There have been accusations of plagiarism in the Indian military doctrines. So one gets the feeling, being on the outside, I'm clearly on the outside, one gets the feeling that this is not a very serious exercise that is undertaken. You do see a lot of quotations being repeated from the Western or even Chinese strategic thinkers, very little from the Indian side. So one gets the feeling that this has had very little discursive process within the armed forces, and may not necessarily have had too much of an impact on the actual behavior of the military itself. If you look at the policies of the Indian military and the doctrinal injunctions of the Indian military, there seems to be a disconnect. So I think at several levels there seems to be a doctrinal evolution, and at a parallel level there is the evolution of the policy and behavior, as it were. Or would you not agree with that?
Yes, that's one of the primary criticisms of this doctrinal process, that it is written in silos. So you've got the army doing its thing and the other services doing their thing. And then between the military and the civilian bureaucracy, there is a disconnect that's in the ministry. And then the wider national security system. You've got the National Security Council and its secretariat in place, which is perhaps integrating things. We have a lot of distance to cover down that road. And since, as you brought out in your own programs earlier, jointness is something that's a deficit within the system. Once that gets into place, you would see more of this. But nevertheless, I believe that we've got the military interfacing between the services at lots of levels. They've got it at the junior level, at the staff colleges. You've got it at the working level, at the at the higher command course level. And then they are also at a senior level at the National Defense College. So they understand each other. And they have service loyalty, certainly. There are these institutional interests, which you yourselves pointed out in your previous program. Obviously, there's distance to cover.
It's a good beginning, you would say.
Yes.
As a scholar and a former military officer, what are some of your recommendations to have better doctrinal thinking in the Indian military? If you were to sort of give a couple of recommendations, what would they be?
I think they're doing fine. They've got excellent way of identifying who are the guys who might be good at this. They've got very competitive system of sorting out who these persons are, especially through their courses. So you can identify them right at the Defense Services Staff College course. Then they even send some of them across to different countries to get a certain exposure. Increasingly, they are getting exposure as defense attaches outside, especially at the junior level. So when they come back in, and this exposure is at every level. Your own army chief has been to the US for one of the courses. So that exposure is very useful when they discuss what's happening in India. What else could be done is perhaps a greater engagement with the academic community in India, and as also academic work outside perhaps. That is obviously increasingly happening, but as you know, the internet is such a wide space. The kind of selective reading that they need to do, they may not be able to. They may be, lost in the internet, so to speak. So if there's one thing that could be suggested is how to narrow down what they need to be exposed to, so as to, make it more focused, condition them better.
Right. You have, Ali, in the past argued that there has been a shift in the Indian doctrinal thinking from defensive to offensive posturing. In 2009, way back in 2009, you wrote that there has been a shift to a deterrent strategic doctrine with an offensive bias. India's strategic doctrine is thus potentially a compellent one, not a deterrent one. In 2014, one of your books, India's Doctrine Puzzle, Limiting War in South Asia, you made the argument that a doctrinal shift in the Indian armed forces since 1971, defensive to offensive posturing and attrition to maneuver warfare. Why do you say that there's an offensive shift? What we often hear in the popular parlance is that India is a very defensive country, it doesn't have an offensive posturing. You seem to sort of have a contrarian view on that. Could you explain that to us?
I would suggest that this phrase that you use, defensive and reactive, is kind of history now. We've moved on. We are self-assured. We are assertive. And that reflects in our military doctrine. So to 71 onwards. 71 itself is an example of how the shift took place. In fact, go back further, 65 for instance. If 62 is taken as some kind of a yardstick when we were really shaken up, thereafter we've seen us doing things. For instance, going across Punjab border in 65 is taken as a proactive step. 71, we dismembered Pakistan.
The war initiation was done by Pakistan, not by India. So to that extent, it was defensive.
Yes, the war initiation, yes. But within the war, the way we went across is something that's remarkable. And it's good for Mr. Shastri's reputation. We've stuck with that. So what I try to argue is that, look, let's not continually, beat ourselves with this idea that we are reactive and defensive, etc. We've been doing well. We are offensive. We assert ourselves when strategically needed. And you see the latest instance in Doklam, for instance, and elsewhere, and surgical strikes, etc. So what I say is, let's stop deluding ourselves that we are, defensive, etc. Let's own up for what we are.
I agree with you on the surgical strikes part. That was quite different from the tradition that India followed so far. We are not getting into the moral ethical considerations of that, but as an act in itself. But what about Doklam? The Chinese have come back with full power in Doklam. The Parliamentary Committee on Foreign Affairs is not even able to table the report on Doklam because the government does not want the committee to table the report, because the report probably contains specifics on how the Chinese have come back to occupy the Doklam once again. So how do you think that was, probably that was an offensive posturing at that point of time, but that might have panned out well eventually. Is that the point that you're trying to make?
Doklam itself, as you concede, was standing up for ourselves, and we're doing it well, etc. Now, if you say that the Chinese are still at it, well, it's something I don't know enough of to comment on right now and right off the cuff. But the fact is that we do what's necessary when necessary.
All right. So the outcome of the surgical strikes. How do you evaluate the outcome of the surgical strikes? You think things have turned out to be in India's favor, or things have become worse for India post-surgical strikes in 2016?
I think there was a certain political messaging through those surgical strikes. And it was to tell Pakistan, look, yes, as you know, there has been this conversation with Pakistan going on since the early part of the century. Now, when we went in for what you call the cold start doctrine or the proactive strategy, Pakistanis came back with saying, hey, we've got tactical nuclear weapons to finesse that. So we then had to, convince them, look, we are serious. This can escalate. Surgical strikes are one way of doing that, to tell them that, look, you don't checkmate us with tactical nuclear weapons. We've got options. So that was one of the utility of surgical strike.
Talking about Pakistan, doctrines also reflect the strategic thinking and strategic culture of a country. And reading India's military doctrines, one gets the feeling that there is a lot of preoccupation on Pakistan. Is that accurate? Is that an accurate reading? One, and if so, what impact does it have on the future Indian strategies? Because we are too preoccupied with one country out there. A lot of other things are happening in the international system, in the neighborhood and beyond. So do you agree with this assessment that it's too preoccupied on Pakistan?
Well, Pakistan cannot be wished away. It is our western neighbor, it's going to remain, and we fought these wars with it. Therefore, it would feature very broad and it loom large, so to speak. But nevertheless, the military has tried to move beyond that, and as India's power has grown, as it has grown economically, it has devoted greater resources to the military side. And then military has also seen itself, and India has seen itself as a regional player and an Asian power. And therefore, China has started looming larger. And therefore, but the shift is not complete as yet. Pakistan remains a serious adversary, and China is also something that we take equally seriously. So that's why we've got this notion of two-front problem.
2.5.
Yes, 2.5.
You're talking about half also.
That's what was the phrase that the chief had used once. But which tells us that yes, China is important, but Pakistan cannot be wished away.
You mentioned cold start doctrine. Does India actually have a cold start doctrine? I'm saying that previously few people talked about the cold start doctrine, and then they started talking about proactive strategy. But recently, the Army Chief Bipin Rawat said that the cold start doctrine exists for conventional military operations. So that is basically trying to say that we do probably have a cold start doctrine. Does India have a cold start doctrine? What's your sort of assessment of it?
I would believe the Army Chief, since he said that we have it. Yes, we have it, and that's again messaging for Pakistan.
If you were not to say that, if he hadn't said that, would you say that India had a?
Yes, indeed, because we would have had to have offensive options because what we want to essentially do is to deter subconventional level strikes by Pakistan. So since we have certain advantages at the conventional level, we try to project those, and cold start is one way of projecting that. So if the chief has accepted it, it is to reassure us that we have options, and to convince Pakistan don't mess with us.
But what about the impact of the cold start doctrine on the sub-regional stability, India-Pakistan regional stability? The Pakistanis have responded to the cold start doctrine by introducing TNWs and sort of threatening that they would probably keep it along the border and pre-delegate to local commanders, etc. So it has vitiated the situation even more for us, no?
Well, there has been no egregious terrorist incident lately, so one would say that they have contributed somewhat to regional stability. Pakistan has perhaps reined in its stormtroopers, the terrorists, etc., who haven't really done anything of the order of 9/11 or 26/11 for the past 10 years. So you would say that regional stability.
Well, going back to the gap, to the time period between 2001 and 2008. 2001 is when India decided that it needs to have more options, and in 2008 we had the terror attack in Mumbai. No action could be taken in 2008 precisely because India was dissuaded by the Pakistani nuclear blackmail. So one has to also look into that fact and say, hey, we have a strategy, we had a strategy at that point of time, maybe not as finished as it is today, but we could not carry out that strategy simply because of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal.
Well, the other reason that I think the National Security Advisor then put out was economic. We didn't really want to go down that path. We, yes, considered that option, and we must consider military options, but obviously if there's something overruling that, for instance, our economics of it, we didn't want to be set back. Our economic miracle was just happening. It was just taking off, etc. And therefore, it seems to be a wise decision.
Ali, looking at some of your writings, I got the feeling that you weren't too happy with the cold start doctrine. You, in fact, wrote that India should have a cold start and stop strategy and not a cold start strategy. Would you explain that to us?
My PhD thesis was on the limited war doctrine. And I wanted to suggest that, look, cold start is great. It's wonderful. It's cognizant of nuclear thresholds. What I wanted was also an explicit limited war doctrine. Cold start is a war doctrine. I was of the impression that, look, we need to have an explicit limited war doctrine, and that the moment you make it explicit, you get it written down, it's something that's accessed even by Pakistan. They know that we are not crossing certain thresholds. They then don't need to go nuclear. So
what is the difference between cold start and stop doctrine?
I said don't go beyond into using your strike force deep in depth, etc., which is how in the exercises that the strike force do, we try to project that, look, this is what we can do to you. I said that might just trigger the threshold of Pakistan.
Can you explain that a little more? Because there's a lot of talk about cold start. If this is a plausible alternative that we have, why don't you explain that to us?
I believe they want the recent joint doctrine that had come out in 2017 that talks of something called integrated warfighting, and I imagine that's integrated theater warfighting, which and they want theater commands, etc., to be able to control the troops which are across the border. My impression is that since this would obviously be unfolding inside Pakistan, that would probably prompt it'll flirt with the nuclear threshold, which would then bring down the house on all the rest of us. So I was trying to suggest that, look, let's be very clear that even if nuclear weapons are introduced into a conflict by Pakistan, we then need to be also responsive at the nuclear level without going down the doctrinal path. The official doctrine has it going massive, etc., which is something that we needed to avoid. So my thrust in writing, etc., is to argue against people who say, let's go the distance.
Okay.
That's why it is called start and stop.
So this is a minimalist approach.
Yes.
Okay, let's come to the nuclear question. That's going to be my last question. Do you think the nuclear doctrine that we have, the 2003 doctrine, which is no more than a page, you think that's an adequate doctrine? What do you think are some of the problems with this doctrine? Even the BJP in its 2014 manifesto said that they would revise the nuclear doctrine to make it more relevant to the current times. So you think, do you think there are problems with the nuclear doctrine? Do you think it needs to be revised? If so, in what ways? You've written extensively about nuclear doctrine and nuclear strategy.
As I said earlier, there was my suspicion is that there's an operational nuclear doctrine which is distinct and different from declaratory nuclear doctrine, especially because of that phrase they have, massive nuclear retaliation. There are other levels of retaliation which need not be massive. They can be, inflicting unacceptable damage. It could be punitive retaliation, could be adequate, sufficient, etc. And those phrases are there in these documents that are related to nuclear doctrine. So since the official doctrine has that phrase, I continually argue against that. It may not be something that we wish to do or would be doing. And that's why I say that if that's not what we intend doing, because it is foolish, let's have something and say it out loud what we intend doing.
What is your objection regarding the massive retaliation concept?
I believe the Pakistanis have taken us seriously. They've gone into vertical proliferation to ensure that they have sufficient to bounce back at us in case we go massive. So what we receive back for our pains will be pain too, which means, and here I agree with Khalid Kidwai, who is the thinker across, that we are in a stage of mutual assured destruction in South Asia. Most Indian authors would deny that. They assume that India would survive, Pakistan would be finished. I agree that Pakistan might be finished, but would India survive is a question mark that I raise. And therefore I say, let's not go massive at all. The other understanding is that, look, massive is something you'll end up with in any case because escalatory compulsions will be so. I say then, let's prepare for that. Let's try and undercut those. Firstly, let's avoid conflict. For which, let's get diplomacy in place. Let's resolve issues like Kashmir, etc.
Okay, Ali, you've said several things. Let me try and unpack that for myself. You're saying that massive retaliation may be a declaratory doctrine, but in actual practice or in the actual operational doctrine, India may have in stock other lower order options. Point one. Point two, you are saying that India should not have a sort of operational doctrine as it were, and then a completely different declared doctrine. Why not declare what you have? Have I got you right?
Yes, indeed. The massive retaliation formulation is something that needs to be jettisoned, which means your doctrine needs to be rewritten. I believe that's already the case. So why don't we have that rephrased doctrine readily available for all? That's why we need to get rid of that phrase. So now I also argue that we should not, under such a circumstance, also go in for a punitive retaliation. Therefore, we need to be flexible. Flexible doctrine is what I argue for. In any case, flexible retaliation, flexible. Now, in any case, nuclear strategy, how it unfolds in a conflict, that could be different. It may be informed by doctrine, but it's not dictated entirely by doctrine. So there could be departures in how nuclear war plays out. What we need to be cognizant of is that there is no necessity for total war. It can still be a limited nuclear war, which there is this opposing school of thought which says there's nothing called a limited nuclear war. That's an oxymoron to them. So that's the debate. I'm on one side of it, and I might be wrong. I hope I'm right.
Ali, wonderful talking to you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yep.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.